Today, we're ending our series on that perennial writing advice, show don't tell, by talking about how this piece of advice applies to world building, or more specifically, getting across information about your world building to the reader. Now, last week we covered show don't tell and exposition, which is closely tied to world building, and I've actually done a video in the past on exposition and world building specifically. So we've covered a lot of this topic already, but I said this would be the last video in the Show Don't Tell series, so here we are. So with the fact that we've covered a lot of information relevant to this topic in other forums already, here are 3 tips for getting across your world building information in a way that shows rather than tells. Tip number 1, tie elements of your world's cultural and physical setting into the main conflict. Have we talked about cultural and physical setting yet? Maybe I should do a video on that. Basically, the physical setting part of your world is all the stuff that would be there without human or societal intervention. So things like the weather, topography, flora, and fauna. Basically, if David Attenborough could narrate it, then that's part of the physical setting. Cultural setting is everything to do with how society works, the type of government, the languages, the caste system, what kind of food they eat, what kind of songs they sing, religion, customs, all that stuff. Basically, if there's a Ken Burns documentary about it, it probably has to do with the cultural setting. Most of what you will need to get across to the reader will fall into one of these 2 categories. If you can build conflict around the physical or cultural parts of your world, then you'll naturally be able to get these details across to the reader. After all, what better way to show that your world has mountainous terrain than having your characters constantly struggling to climb mountains, or to show that a society has a rigid caste system by forcing certain segments of the population to always climb mountains. I talked about this in the exposition video last week. If you have details you need to get across to the reader, it's much easier to do it without telling if those details are relevant to the conflict or plot or characters of the story. Speaking of the characters, tip number 2, have your readers learn about the world through a character who is also learning about the world. If you have characters who live in and already know about your particular world, then there isn't much reason for it to be explained to them. Having characters discuss things that they are already aware of is what's known as maid and butler dialogue, and it's something that should generally be avoided. This creates a problem though, as the reader doesn't know as much as the characters do. So if the characters aren't discussing or explaining it, then this information is likely going to end up dumped into expository passages and moved firmly into telling territory. Enter the outsider character. They've just stepped off the boat, or plane, or flying cat, or whatever strange transport system exists in your world, and they don't know anything. They are as clueless as someone trying to come up with a simile. The advantages of this kind of character are obvious. You now have a character who is as clueless as the reader, so it gives you an excuse to have the rest of the cast explain every relevant detail to them. You can now explain world-building details through dialogue and show a character's reaction to different parts of the world the first time that they see them. When something happens in the world that might be confusing to the reader, you have a character in the story who is just as confused. There are some common issues that you need to avoid with this approach, however. As I talked about in the Show Don't Tell dialogue video, moving a dump of tele-exposition from narrative into dialogue doesn't necessarily improve the writing and might actually make things worse. You want to make sure that your outsider character is actually relevant to the plot and not just there so that other characters have a place to aim their exposition. They should have complete motivations and serve an integral role in the story. These motivations should drive what information and what kinds of questions they ask and what elements of the world interest them. In other words, make sure your outsider character is actually a character, not just a stand-in for the confused reader. Maybe you understood that already based on what I've said before. Tip number 3, imply until you're blue in the face. Being blue in the face means that you've been doing something for a while and are therefore oxygen deprived. You might have already known that. This is basically the cardinal rule of how to show and not tell. You give the reader details and let them infer the meaning rather than telling them directly. And this applies to world building. You can imply all kinds of details in a world based on the actions, dialogue, and thoughts of the characters in that world, without the reader being directly told all of this information. Do this correctly and you can get a lot of information across without directly telling the reader anything. Do this incorrectly, however, and you could end up confusing the reader or risk having them miss a piece of plot-critical world building. This is the main disadvantage of showing, especially when it comes to world building. Because showing requires the reader to infer details based on the information provided, there's a chance they may not be able to infer those details. Or worse, they may infer the wrong details. This is an especially acute problem with world building because world building tends to require a lot of information to be passed to the reader, and they will need to pick up on a lot of details. The most straightforward way to overcome this, obviously, is to simply tell the reader the piece of information rather than having them fill in the details themselves. As we've talked about throughout this series, there are times where it's better to tell information rather than show the reader. Knowing when to do this is where things get complicated. Remember that the main advantage of telling is that you can get a lot more information across in much fewer words than you can with showing. While telling is more abstract and not as narratively engaging as showing, if it means that you can get a certain piece of plot-critical world building across to the reader more clearly with a higher chance of them understanding it, then it might be worthwhile to do. I've talked about that a fair bit throughout this series, that show don't tell isn't so much a matter of eliminating all telling, but rather knowing when showing is appropriate and when telling is appropriate. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this video and found the advice in it useful, and I hope you enjoyed the entire Show Don't Tell series. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can check out all my other writing advice related videos and subscribe to my channel. I post new videos every Wednesday. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.